to what extent, after what we saw happened in Venezuela at the weekend, does this use of force, does this lower the bar for Russia on Ukraine and China on Taiwan?
I don't think so. I mean, China's been planning contingencies related to Taiwan for several decades now. And the idea that somehow in the last 24 hours, all of their plans have changed, shifted, or they're going to make decisions is frankly fantastical. I would say, first of all, I don't think the Venezuela piece of this story is over. There's a lot of talk about regime change, but the reality is the United States left the security apparatus in Venezuela intact. It left the Venezuelan military intact. It left paramilitary groups and gangs intact. It left several of the officials in the Chavista regime who were truly nasty pieces of work intact. And so the Venezuela story has not yet run its course. At a strategic level, though, this isn't, as you're implying, just about Venezuela. After all, what the United States is asserting, and the Secretary of State, Marco Rubio, has made this quite explicit on television in the last 24 hours, is that it will exercise primacy in its own hemisphere. And the question is whether that is enforceable on countries, number one, that want to have agency themselves, number two, have substantial economic relationships with China. China in 2024 had a $512 billion two-way trading relationship with the region. The United States can't invade everybody. And so while the United States is asserting that, I think the story here is much larger. There's also the question of what the impact on Asia will be. And there, if people think the world is dividing into spheres of influence, that just because the United States is asserting this, it's somehow going to give China a free hand in Asia, I beg to differ. I think that's fantastical, too. The United States will have to is going to try to have it both ways, to assert its dominance here in the Western Hemisphere while trying to deny China one in East Asia at the same time. And that contradiction is inherent to U.S. foreign policy.
I also want to get your take on some of the more latest comments from President Trump just in the last couple of hours while he was on board Air Force One, where he says that if they don't behave, Venezuela that is, they will do a second strike, and that the U.S. needs to have access to oil and other things in Venezuela. Is this alarming to you?
Well, sure, because he's threatening a full-scale invasion, and the United States has had some experience with that in Iraq and other places, and it hasn't always been successful. The oil piece, by the way, is relevant to that. I'm not a commodities guy, but if you look at what happened with Iraq, it's not as if it was a sea change immediately in oil supply to the global market. I mean, I've seen references today that's 60 billion plus in capex that's going to be required in Venezuela. So the idea that the world has just turned upside down and is going to change by next Tuesday is kind of preposterous in and of itself. A lot of work will have to be done in Venezuela to modernize energy infrastructure. China became a big part of that picture, largely because American sanctions meant that the United States wasn't buying Venezuelan oil anymore. But to China, Venezuela is not in any way a core interest. It's actually a small part of China's imported oil picture, somewhere between 4 and 7%, depending on how you count it. So as your previous guests were implying, I think what China's going to try to do here is basically accept reality in Venezuela while making a lot of hay rhetorically about international law, first to try to point to American hypocrisy when the United States tries to raise that in places like the South China Sea. And they seem to be getting some traction. Some of the statements from ASEAN countries today, most notably from Prime Minister Anwar of Malaysia, were actually quite condemnatory of the U.S. action. But second, China is trying to win friends and influence people everywhere, and they will attempt, maybe successfully, maybe not, to point to the United States as kind of the roguish actor here. And whether that gets traction will depend a lot on what happens next. But I will tell you, if the United States launches what you were talking about, which is a full-scale land invasion of Venezuela, the Chinese will make a lot of hay about that, too.
I want to get your take on the Chinese economic interest in Venezuela. You did touch on that a moment ago, but just hours before the capture, so we're going to rewind the clock here. A high-level Chinese delegation met with Maduro in the capital. What do you make of that? What was that all about? And we haven't heard anything about the safety of those individuals.
Yeah, I mean, honestly, I didn't think it was an especially high-level delegation. It was the Ministry of Foreign Affairs Special Envoy for Latin America, who, I mean, showed up in Cuba a few months ago, travels around the region. The Ministry of Foreign Affairs is not exactly the nerve center of power in China. And so I thought some of it was routine. It's obvious the Chinese didn't know what was coming, but obviously the Venezuelan regime, the Chavista regime, and Mr. Maduro didn't know it was coming either. The Chinese have been awfully quiet, other than, as I said, these fairly boilerplate condemnatory statements. Actually, I thought Prime Minister Anwar's statement was tougher on the United States in some ways than the Chinese statement. So China's had some buyer's remorse, frankly, on some of what they've done economically with Venezuela over the years. I don't believe they've done a lot of lending over the last decade or so. One reason why there are oil sales to China, actually, is because oil is a commodity that's used by Venezuela to repay China for some of the lending that it had done. So, the Chinese have a strategic relationship with Venezuela, obviously had an oil relationship, a commercial relationship. It needled the United States in a lot of different ways. Secretary Rubio made that point. But as I said, this is not a core interest for China. And I would not make the mistake, as some are, of extrapolating from this to say that because X, Y, and Z happened in Venezuela, therefore that we can say that China will do A, B, and C in East Asia. Its core interests are pretty clear. And those are core interests that it's been planning around for a few decades now.
We heard from President Xi Jinping in his New Year's Eve address talking about Taiwan, that the reunification is unstoppable, the fact that both sides of the Taiwan Strait share the same bloodline. In terms of the timeline now, does this do anything? Does this move the needle on China's reunification?
This does not, but I think the Chinese are experimenting with how to mix and match coercive tools in much more aggressive ways now than if you compare it to 5 years ago, much less 10 years ago. For China, coercion of Taiwan is not, in fact, an event. It is a process, and they have a pretty large kit bag of military, economic, commercial, financial, cyber, diplomatic tools from which they mix and match routinely. This latest exercise was obviously in part designed to intimidate, but also designed to showcase certain kinds of capabilities, for example, blockade capabilities. And I would note, by the way, that it predated the U.S. strike to pick up Mr. Maduro in Venezuela. So I think the larger issue is what are the ways that China is thinking about the trend lines, and what are the factors that would go into a Chinese decision to use both kinetic and non-kinetic force. Taiwan has a presidential election coming up in 2028, and in fact a split government in which the opposition controls the legislature and has been quite a thorn in the side of the Democratic Progressive Party controlled executive. And attempts to recall some of those opposition legislators, as you know, have failed at more than double digits in a recent recall attempt. So I think as China's looking forward, they have no particular reason to be relaxed from their point of view. But nonetheless, I don't think what's happened in Venezuela is dispositive in shaping their decision calculus.
I'm glad you brought up the presidential elections, and I want to bring it back to when President Tsai Ing-wen was re-elected for a second term. Now, she really won that time because what we were experiencing here in Hong Kong was protest. And at the time, they were saying things like Hong Kong today, Taiwan tomorrow, and that will really help to bring her back into office for a second term. Now, we're seeing some commentary that's being circulated now. Venezuela today, Taiwan tomorrow. What are the limits to this analogy?
Well, I think there's a lot of people in China who are prepared to say just the most outrageous things. However, I think more notable was some of the propaganda and messaging that was connected to the latest exercise. There were some very pregnant images. There were things that were clearly designed to be scary, coercive, intimidate, shape the calculus in Taiwan, including the public view of things. And what's interesting to me is that the Chinese are leaning increasingly on coercive tools and much less on persuasive tools. That suggests something about what they think the direction of travel is, but it's certainly very unsettling to people in Taiwan and beyond who argue that that kind of intimidation is not productive for the region.
I want to get your take on how some of the reaction, global reaction, in particular the Latin America states, what does this signal of Chinese influence in the Western Hemisphere? We got that joint statement come through from Spain, Brazil, Chile, Colombia, Mexico, and Uruguay, basically condemning the acts of the United States. What does this mean for China?
Well, I think there are two issues there. What does it mean for China and Latin America? And second, what does it mean in Asia more broadly? Frankly, for the United States, if I can flip that around, because it's the United States that was the acting party here, and people are drawing their own conclusions from that. I mean, in Latin America, as I said earlier, China has a $512 billion two-way trading relationship in 2024. And while the pace and scope of some of the direct investment has slowed down, that's a pretty big profile. And so if the United States' intent is to basically run around and say, don't take China's money, don't let China build any infrastructure, don't do any trade, there is a question about how realistic that is to unwind, quite apart from the intimidation factor. There's also the question of what that messaging is to Latin Americans who think they ought to have something to say about the future of their countries and about the region. The reactions in the region seem to me, and I'm not a Latin America expert, to have broken down, not surprisingly, largely on ideological lines. You mentioned President Milei of Argentina being quite approving. President Lula and his government in Brazil are much less approving and obviously are much more skeptical. Same thing, I saw what the president of Chile, who leans left, said. We have an incoming government in Chile that is to the right of center and more like the Argentinian government, and they'd be maybe more accommodating in the United States. So that will play out. But if the United States thinks it can just coerce everybody, that's a pretty unproductive message to the region and will be received that way. The more interesting thing, though, is what this means for the United States in Asia. You know, there's a lot of hoo-ha, as I said earlier, about spheres of influence, that the United States somehow will focus on the hemisphere and cede Asia to China and Europe to Russia. That is just patently nonsense. If you look at the recent national security strategy that the Trump administration issued, there are just umpteen references to American preeminence in Asia. Economic preeminence, technological preeminence, military preeminence. It doesn't sound like a United States that's prepared to simply hand off the region to China. The problem with that, I think, is just twofold. The United States has very little credibility. It talks about openness, transparency, democracy, market capitalism. Nobody in Asia believes the United States stands for those things after the United States tariffed everybody out the wazoo and is basically protecting its market. And then second, and more importantly, the United States wants this primacy in Asia on the cheap. It's not prepared to provide public goods, to keep its market open, to provide technology to everybody. It's exacting a price. That's a very different approach to Asia than the United States has had historically. And if I may be blunt about it, it actually gives China some openings to try to seek some accommodation. And that's why I said earlier, China may accommodate Venezuela and what has happened there because it's not a core interest, but it's going to make a lot of hay about what the United States has done to its neighbors in Asia. And I'll be interested to see what kind of traction it gets, because I think it's going to get more than the United States would like.